So, welcome everyone to another episode of the PathCheck Dice Global Health Innovators Talk Series. Here we talk about crowdsourced computational health solutions. And if you'd like to know more about our organization, please visit https://pathcheck.org and also visit dice.pathcheck.org. And if you're interested to join our dynamic research volunteer team, please head over to tiny.cc/pathcheck Slack. You can join our Slack group and start on research projects, blogs, and many more. And if you're interested to find out more about the previous talks, please go and visit tiny.cc/PCF Research Talks. So once quickly thanking all my co-organizers over here, Professor Ramesh Raskar, Dr. Nisi Hudson, Graham Dodge, Nina Rasik, and Krishnan Dasgupta. Thanks a lot for helping put this talk together. So a quick introduction about what this talk entails. It's basically a research meetup where we bring in speakers who are creating an impact in digital health using AI, software, and technology. And the primary motive for this talk is to drive collaborations in AI health, which is more multi-pronged with collaborations from computer science, medicine, bioinformatics, and much more. With that, I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Thomas Kingsley. Tom has been a long-time collaborator with us, so quick introduction. Dr. Thomas Kingsley is a physician and assistant professor of medicine at Mayo Clinic and is the chief epidemiologist and health officer for PathCheck Foundation. He is an applied informatics and AI researcher with the goal of translating data into model to innovation or improved decision-making and policy. He has won multiple awards, including the Best AI Project of 2020 at Mayo Clinic. With that, once again, thanks, Tom, for giving this talk, and take it away.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here, Rohan. Thank you for PathCheck and DICE for having me today. I'm going to share some slides. There you go. I'm just going to pull it up here. Can you guys see?
Yep. Yes, we can.
There you go. So I think maybe just to give some background, I want to talk about monkeypox today. This is obviously probably a topic on a lot of people's mind as we are still in the COVID pandemic. I think people are probably pretty concerned hearing that another virus is now spreading across the globe. So I know a lot of people probably don't know a lot about monkeypox. So I think for a couple slides, I just kind of want to introduce the topic. So monkeypox has actually been around for a while. There's, and I'll get into that a little bit, but there's right now 7,000 cases globally, about 600 in the United States. And this marks a large deviation from kind of typical monkeypox outbreaks. Mostly these have occurred in Central and West Africa, where it's endemic. Occasionally, there has been outbreaks outside of these endemic regions, but typically that they're associated with travelers and can be traced back to origins in these endemic regions. The most recent outbreak is really a deviation from that. And so I think that's what's getting a lot of people concerned, and especially the amount of cases we have is a large deviation from kind of historical context with prior outbreaks. And so the first case happened here in the United States in mid-May. And like I said, now we have about 600. So what is monkeypox? Monkeypox is actually in the family, same as smallpox. In a lot of ways, looks a lot like smallpox. And for those of you who don't know, smallpox obviously was a terrible disease responsible for upwards estimates of at some points killing 30% of the human population. Good news is monkeypox, unlike smallpox, is not nearly as deadly, but obviously, is an issue and can infect humans. The name monkeypox is actually a little bit of a misnomer. It does infect monkeys. It was actually, and that's where it was first described, but the primary host is typically rodents. So there's about 6 or 7 rodent species that are local to these Central and Western African countries. And this is really where monkeypox lives. In the 1950s, monkeypox was first found in a group of monkeys in Europe that were being used for polio research, and that's where it got its name. And then the first human cases happened in the 1970s in Central Africa. And initially, cases were pretty limited. There'd be small outbreaks, all contained within these African countries that had these animal hosts. And then and part of the theory is that maybe because we stopped, when we eradicated smallpox, we stopped giving out vaccination. And in the early 2000s, we started seeing an increase in cases in these endemic countries. So I'm just going to kind of describe what are the clinical manifestations of monkeypox in most of those infected. So typically, monkeypox starts as, well, after infection, usually it takes about 2 weeks before you develop symptoms. And then there's usually a period for about 1 to 5 days of pretty intense fever and lymphadenopathy. That's just where your lymph nodes get really swollen. And then there's this very characteristic rash stage. And this happens usually around day 5 or 6. And the rash evolves in this fairly interesting, kind of unique way. It starts as kind of a flat lesion. And so you can see here in the slide, this kind of shows the evolution. But it starts as kind of this flat lesion. It becomes more raised, and then it becomes vesicular, which just means it's full of fluid. And then that vesicle opens up. Sometimes it develops a kind of dome center, and then crusts over and then heals. And when people are infectious is during this rash stage, is from what we know. And the rash is supposed to be pretty painful and pretty itchy once it starts healing. It's very characteristic of rash. And you can see that it can cover large portions of the body. So this is a picture from back in the 1970s in the DRC. It affects children pretty badly. Those are usually where we see mortality, is in children or immunocompromised. And like I said, it can cover the entire body. It can cover the oral mucosa. It's found on the palms and soles, which is can help distinguish it from other rashes. And just a little bit more about transmission. So like I was saying, the primary host is typically rodents. We don't know all the hosts, but there's been 6 or 7 identified in these endemic African countries. There's been no rodents outside of those endemic countries that have become known primary hosts. And then typically the first, when outbreaks happen, it's because of a rodent spreading disease to a human. That can be either because of dealing with meat products during food preparation, or that can be just close contact or animal bite. And then human to human spread is possible. Typically this occurs because someone has direct contact with a rash. There hasn't been proven other methods of transmission, such as sex or from oral secretions, but there is some suspicion that it can spread this way. And it has shown to spread from mother to fetus. And so, as I was talking about, there's, it's really been endemic in West and Central Africa since the 1970s, for a long time. This is a DNA virus. So, I think everybody's been thinking about COVID, and COVID's an RNA virus. DNA viruses tend to not mutate as much. So the genome is more stable. So we get less variants, but I mean, this virus has been around for a long time, so there are a lot of variants. Typically, the variants found in Central Africa are more deadly than and more serious symptoms than the ones found in West Africa. And you can see here on the left, this diagram just kind of shows a lot of these various variants that are found in endemic countries. And the mortality rate for monkeypox has been around 10% in these African countries during outbreaks. But when we see outbreaks happen outside of these African countries, the mortality is much lower. So we haven't seen any mortality from any of the cases in the United States. In 2003, there was an outbreak in the United States. This was actually really concerning. The first infected individual was a 3-year-old girl, and she got it from a prairie dog, which is a type of rodent. And what happened was there was somehow a rodent from one of these African countries got over to the United States and Illinois and infected a prairie dog. And then there was a kind of a large amount of infections amongst these prairie dogs, so that then infected human hosts. And so the concern is if monkeypox becomes, finds a new host in these prairie dogs, which are common in the Midwest, that we will have monkeypox for good here. Luckily, we were able to eradicate it, and there wasn't any monkeypox cases after this one in 2003. There were 70 human cases, no deaths, and so it was pretty well contained. Now compare that to the 2002 outbreak. We don't actually really understand how this happened. So like I said, there's about 600 cases right now. The first case was in May. The outbreak actually began in Europe. There is some theories about how this occurred, but we still don't understand enough to know how this spread out. But like I was saying before, most of these prior outbreaks, there was always a link back to an outbreak in one of these endemic regions in Africa, and this time we don't have as clear of a story. So, I think some good news is that, like I said, there's been no deaths, and we've sequenced the genome of the latest outbreak, and it looks like a similar genome to an outbreak that happened in Nigeria in 2018 and 2019, and that there hasn't been much change to the virus. So this current outbreak doesn't necessarily represent change of the monkeypox virus and more ability to infect humans. It's because of its genome being so similar to this prior outbreak linked in Nigeria. And so I think that's good news. But obviously this is really concerning that we've had this many cases. So we do have testing for monkeypox. Right now, only a few labs in the United States are conducting this test. LabCorp is the biggest one. They have the capability of about doing 10,000 tests a day, which we haven't needed yet and hopefully won't. And other facilities such as Mayo Clinic as well. There are treatments for monkeypox because it's so similar to smallpox. Treatments for smallpox often work with monkeypox. We have antiviral medication. We also have 2 vaccines. Immune is the one that is being rolled out the most in the United States. The Biden administration has already put in an order for, I think, 4 million vaccines. I think there's 10 1,000 that have already been administered. And this vaccine has, at least in animal models, shown to be fairly effective, and suspicion is it will probably be pretty effective in monkeypox in this latest outbreak if it needs to be. And we can use this vaccine not only typically as a vaccine for preventative measures, but also post-exposure prophylaxis and pre-exposure prophylaxis for healthcare workers and others that are going to be at high risk of exposure. The vaccine, at least the Janos vaccine, has shown to have few side effects. It's a live viral vaccine, but it's non-replicating, so it's fairly safe for use. And I'm going to stop there, and I want to take questions and kind of open it to discussion.
So I'm just wondering, you know, since we started reporting on monkeypox, at least at Hood Medicine, we made our first infographic around Memorial Weekend, and just in a short time, then we only had like 13 cases, and now you're talking about like 600, right? Just here in the US. And maybe you could explain for the audience like what R0 is for a virus, what that concept is, and maybe talk about how human behavior affects R0 in terms of the contact rate.
Yeah, no, R0 is a really important number that we look at for any infectious disease, and basically what it is it's the replication number in a population that is completely susceptible to usually an emerging disease. And what it means is how many people do you expect from an infected individual? How many people in the next generation of infection do you expect to get infected? So for viruses, any R0 above 1 means that the virus is going to grow in the population, or the infectious agent is going to grow in the population. And so we look at the R0 as a way of kind of gauging spread in a population, how quickly it's spreading, and the growth potential for the virus. We don't have a good estimate of the R0 on monkeypox currently, but clearly it's above 1. It's growing pretty rapidly, and part of the reason we don't have a good estimate on the R0 is that the testing capabilities is so limited that we're probably missing a lot of cases. And so the R0, any calculation of the R0 based on current case growth probably would underestimate the true R0. The good news about the spread is it typically happens when people are symptomatic. So awareness of this disease hopefully will lead to some decrease of spread, because people are probably unknowingly spreading disease, not realizing that they have monkeypox.
So how is that possible, I guess, because if we're talking about the spread during the contagious part, during the symptomatic portion of illness, does that mean when you already have lesions, like how would someone be unaware that they're infected?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and I think it's one that a lot of people are still wrestling with, and we don't have a totally clear answer for it. So, monkeypox obviously can spread to the entire body, and I think people usually know that they're infected with something different when their entire body's covered in lesions. But what we're finding is in a lot of these cases with this most recent outbreak, that lesions are fairly isolated, and they're in regions that we typically didn't see monkeypox isolated to. So in the genital, they're in your genitals, and they're in your rectal area and your mucosa. And so there is some thought that maybe this is spreading through sex, which hadn't been well described before in monkeypox. And so there is some suspicion that this is spreading through sex, and in people that have fairly limited lesions in just these areas, and it can look like herpes. And so people who have known herpes maybe don't realize that this is different, There have been increases in incidence in this current outbreak in the population of men who have sex with men, and obviously this could just be incidental, but it could also speak maybe to causes of how it's spreading as well. So there's a lot we don't know and we're trying to figure out, but I think probably the reason that we're seeing this the spread that we are this time is partly because of these kind of more limited regions of the body that are being affected, and people not identifying it as monkeypox and probably thinking it's something else.
Are there any correlations with trends related to the COVID-19 outbreak that anyone is identifying, or is that mostly seen as like a confounder at this point in terms of sort of, that's actually unrelated?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. I haven't seen anything trying to connect them. Have you, Graham?
No, no. I mean, I've heard people, guess at certain things, but I also wonder are the precautions that have been developed as a result of COVID-19, like mask wearing and things like that, would they have had anything to do with preventing this from being a worse outbreak, or is there basically no way that the precautions used for COVID-19 would in any way prevent monkeypox from spreading?
Yeah, I think, speaking to masks specifically, probably not, because there's no evidence that monkeypox spreads through respiratory droplets. And so probably not from mask wearing, but certainly I think some of the infrastructure we built around COVID prevention, especially pre-vaccine, so thinking about some of the digital exposure notification apps and things like that, I think there could be a large role for that, because one of the challenges with COVID remained that a lot of spread happened in asymptomatic stages. Some people never developed symptoms, and so you really had a population split into victims and vectors, right? And that made it really hard to do adequate contact tracing. Monkeypox is a great use case for contact tracing. People develop symptoms, then become infectious. And so awareness and identification of cases and contact tracing, or potentially digital exposure notification, actually becomes even a more useful tool than it was for COVID. And so I think some of that infrastructure, especially around some of the technology offerings, is actually going to be more useful potentially for monkeypox than it was for COVID.
In terms of, like, you mentioned that the smallpox vaccine is used primarily, but what is the access and sort of supply look like for that? Because we haven't really had to use it in a while. So are we ramped up and ready to go with that vaccine, or what's that look like?
Yeah, I mean, the US government stockpiles these vaccines for, really it was for smallpox and for the bioterrorism threats that, because smallpox is an agent of the potential concern, but luckily has shown to be efficacious in monkeypox. The company that makes, the two companies that make the monkeypox or smallpox vaccine are ramping up and have new orders from the United States. Right now, our supply is fairly limited, from my understanding. I think, in the several million range. So certainly not for ready for entire population vaccination. And I don't think it's warranted, and it may never be. I think where we're really going to see early use of the vaccine are going to be in healthcare providers that are going to be, on the front lines per se, or like, in areas where we're seeing larger cases, and then other individuals that we think could possibly be susceptible, especially like immunocompromised, possibly, if we see this continue to grow, and maybe even children, because where we have seen higher mortality rates have been in those two populations.
That's what I'm worried about most as a mom, especially going back, heading back into the school year where we've kind of gotten rid of all of our COVID protections. That means the kids are all intermingling, and we all know how Cox works in general, and how kids don't really have those like personal space barriers anyway. What is your outlook for like the back to school session this year with monkeypox on the horizon?
Monkeypox is, I still don't think a really big threat in the United States to most individuals. I think that cases are still limited and prevalence is really low. And, I think we'll probably know a lot more in the next coming months, but I would say for right now, it is alarming in that, this is definitely a different path than we've ever seen monkeypox take, but it's still the risk to most individuals, including children and of school age, are still really, really low. Looking ahead, I think in terms of the vaccine, one possibility is because it can be effective in post-exposure is, another important reason to get testing, build our testing up, is because if we identify areas where we're starting to see outbreaks, we could potentially send supplies of this limited vaccine to those areas where people who are being exposed could get vaccinated quickly as kind of a post-exposure prophylaxis strategy. But yeah, I think for the most part right now, there's not a lot of reason for any individual or their family to be too concerned.
Yeah, we've seen that a little bit in New York recently, particularly targeting that community of like men who have sex with men, that patient population. But do you get the sense that this is going to be something that we might run the risk of mismanaging the way we did sort of early HIV outbreaks?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the Biden administration seems to be really aggressively, they've already invested in a large amount of vaccine from the companies that offer it. And the testing has already been ramped up. I think we've already seen, in my opinion, more of a response to a much less serious disease than COVID was, but yet we're seeing a bigger response. And so I've been pretty happy with the response I've seen from the current administration. It seems like, if anything, we're reacting faster and more aggressively than I think we probably would have in pre-COVID time. And so I think awareness and testing capabilities are going to be the most important part of this, because people are fairly symptomatic when they become contagious. And so if they are aware of monkeypox, if there's testing, this is a disease we can typically contain. And when we've had outbreaks in these endemic countries in Africa, we've containment's actually been pretty effective. And so I think we can do that here in the United States as well.
Do we know how long it can survive on surfaces?
I don't know. Yeah. There has been reports of it as what we call fomite, which is that it can, there are a lot of viruses that can live on surfaces for hours to even days. And there have been reports that monkeypox spreads this way. I haven't seen anything that provides really good evidence of how long it can survive on surfaces, though.
Yeah,
but certainly seems like it's possible.
It seems like if there's, is there a concern at all for it jumping, I guess, through rodents, getting into the waste or garbage of an infected individual who has been, advanced stages with the rash, and I don't know, somehow getting it from people? Has that ever happened, where the rodents then pick it up from the waste of humans?
I don't know of spread that way, but it would make sense to me. I mean, rodents seem to be the natural host for monkeypox, and so it would make sense that it could happen that way. And I think that, to a broader point, the biggest concern of this spread is, are there new rodent hosts in some of these countries that we're seeing widespread, like the United States and the UK, where we're seeing a lot of cases? And if there is an animal host, then we're in a lot of trouble. One reason smallpox, although it was much more deadly than monkeypox, was we were able to eradicate it, is it didn't have a natural, its primary host, and really its only host was humans. And so we could eradicate it. Once it gets into an animal host and it can survive and spread here in the United States or other countries that have not historically been endemic, it's going to be really hard to eradicate. And I think monkeypox will be here to stay. So that's a kind of, I think, a most alarming part of this is, has it found an animal host?
Are you, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just curious, there's, in thinking about COVID-19 and surveillance and how these things are being tracked, are you seeing some of the same systems, whether it be wastewater, monitoring, or other ways in which, lessons learned during COVID that are being used or could be used during this monkeypox?
Yeah, I think we're not seeing that because the prevalence, although 600 cases is certainly alarming in the context of, monkeypox is still means that the prevalence in any given population is incredibly low. And so some of those other methods mentioned, we start using with, large swaths of the population, especially with COVID, because there was so much asymptomatic spread. It was really hard to estimate the burden of disease. In monkeypox, it's much easier to estimate. It doesn't spread as easily because it's usually through contact. And so, and people are symptomatic. Now, one of the concerns I'd mentioned about before is maybe because we're seeing, individuals spread disease with fairly limited lesions in areas that we haven't always seen it, like the genital region, and maybe this is spreading through sex. So maybe there isn't as much awareness as there had been. But I think the most important part of surveillance measure right now is just kind of beefing up the PCR testing for the disease. And so and we're doing that, and that's, the Biden administration has been working to improve the testing capabilities. And so LabCorp is, like I said, is now able to do 10,000 tests a day, which is well beyond probably what's needed. Now, it'd be good to, if this continues to spread this way, we need to start having labs more locally have monkeypox testing available, because the turnaround time for these send out labs is still fairly long. And so we'd want to have more local testing, because there is possibility of doing post-exposure prophylaxis if you find someone who's infected. Although I guess if they're probably getting testing, they have symptoms, and it may be too late for post-exposure prophylaxis, but certainly for surveillance.
So when you say we want to ramp up testings, is there like an RT-PCR versus antigen equivalent over here? Do we have faster methods of testing for this particular disease?
Yeah, so I don't know what the testing, the different testing modalities, and do we have rapid PCR? I don't know the answer to that, but the other thing with monkeypox is it has a fairly long incubation period, and the symptoms last a while. I didn't actually really dive into that, but symptoms can last a month. So it's a much longer disease course than COVID. So yeah, and testing. So testing turnaround times are always going to be important in kind of adequate public health response. But I think with monkeypox, the testing turnaround time is a little less critical than it was for COVID, where you really, people were developing symptoms in 1 or 2 days of exposure and infectious almost right away. So.
Right, makes sense. So I guess one other question would be like, it's a more generic question, like, is there any particular lesson that we learned from COVID that could be much useful in this scenario, given that we've been through such a situation for 2.5 years? So probably, yeah.
Yeah, I think COVID taught us a lot, and we're already seeing that. And I think the response to monkeypox, we're seeing investment in testing immediately. Now there's, like I said, there's 5 labs that are doing it. There's going to be a lot more in the near future. We're seeing investment in vaccines. Luckily, we have them. We didn't for COVID. But I also think there's a lot of tools that we built during the COVID pandemic that are going to be really helpful. And if this continues to spread. So like I was mentioning, some of the digital tools that we were using, like digital exposure notification, I think would be very helpful in monkeypox if we start seeing more and more disease in the United States. And so I do think we've learned a lot of lessons. We're responding much faster than I think we would have if this had happened before COVID. And I think that gets at some of the lessons that we've learned. And I hope to see, if this continues to spread, that there's investment in some of these other modalities of stopping spread, like possible digital tools that can be used. Because like I said, awareness and exposure notification could be really important in monkeypox. Contact tracing has been very useful in some of these endemic countries when there's been outbreaks.
Is there any density in the U.S. in any particular city or state currently, or is it pretty evenly spread out? And are all those people who have recently traveled, or is there any data on that yet?
Yeah, I don't know the states that have the most cases. I don't know if there's a state that seems like it's a really good question. I don't know a state that has the most burden. I could probably pull it up right now and look, but I think what's concerning is that the cases don't have people that have clearly traveled. And so this is spreading in the United States person to person, which is unique compared even to the 2003 outbreak, where it was really prairie dogs, exposure to prairie dogs that had been exposed to this rodent from an African country, where we were seeing spread. Here we're seeing what appears to be human to human spread from individuals that have not traveled. So spread in the United States, which is the first time we've seen that.
Yeah, it appears that New York might have the most cases. I'm looking at the interactive map right now, but it's also relative to their population, because California has a fairly close number of cases to New York's as well. So it may just be following, dense population density.
Right.
In that sense, do you feel like thus far people have been responsive to public health advisories? Because we know that, we've had a lot of failings in terms of our response with COVID and getting, adoption of vaccine uptake, and certainly now for people to heed, prevention measures and do things to continue to mitigate spread. But do you have the sense that people are taking it seriously?
I don't have a great sense of that. I think, in terms of, what we saw with COVID, the kind of the second pandemic was the infodemic, and, and often in a lot of ways, made COVID a lot more deadly than it should have been. And, we continue to see this infodemic infiltrate in other parts of our life and other arenas outside of just healthcare. And there's to me, there's no suggestion that it's gone away. We're still suffering from the infodemic, even as COVID has become less severe in a lot of ways, and that people are vaccinated and boosted, and we're not seeing as many hospitalizations and deaths. But this infodemic seems like it's continuing to rage on, and will continue to affect our ability to effectively have, public health interventions, maybe even elections. There's a lot that this infodemic, a lot of areas of life that it's affecting. And I don't have good solutions there. I think one of the most concerning things for humanity is how do we figure out how to deal with that. So I think it will be a challenge if monkeypox does start to really spread. I think we'll see a lot of those same divisions and misinformation that we saw with COVID, unfortunately.
That's worrisome.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about the disease sort of presentation and the timeline, but did you mention how it kind of resolves? Does it typically resolve on its own, or do you need to have the antiviral treatment?
Yeah, these are mostly most cases are resolve on their own, don't need treatment. Like I said, most cases there's never been any deaths outside of these endemic areas. There's been, even in this latest outbreak, there's been no deaths. There's been some hypothesis to that. Maybe it's because it's this West African Nigeria variant that has been known to be less deadly. Maybe it's because places with adequate access to healthcare and infrastructure and supportive care prevent deaths. It's not totally clear, but usually the way that it resolves is that those vesicular lesions open up, they scab over, and then eventually heal. And most deaths, from my understanding, have been, and because there's, even though it's been endemic in these countries, there's still a lot to be learned, but are often from secondary infections, when the skin's opening up, because these, when you have widespread lesions on your skin, you can get secondary bacterial infections that can then cause sepsis. And so usually the mortality is related around to these secondary infections that are caused from widespread disease, skin lesions that are opening up and causing issues.
So right now, who is still sort of not, it hasn't been, designated as a pandemic or as, an emergency, but what would be the tipping point for that to change?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, probably continued growth of disease and showing that, a lot of these I guess I should take a step back. A lot of these outbreaks before, happened in kind of isolated regions. Containment methods were implemented, and usually fairly quickly we saw a stop of spread. I think if, now we have disease in most of the states in the US, I think what would be alarming is if we continue to see growth in those states, would suggest that even with public awareness and even with availability of testing, this is spreading. And, I think there's a lot that's unknown. Like I was saying, maybe this is spreading through methods that are, maybe it's spreading through sex and with limited lesions, which would make it harder for people to know that they were infectious. And if that's the case, I think we would be, this could become a serious threat. And we'll know that, I think, probably in the next month or two, when we see how these counts go up. If they continue to go up with available testing and with increased public awareness, I think then it becomes fairly urgent, and that what we don't want to see is similar to COVID, this to become endemic in the United States and these other countries.
So it is obviously a different virus altogether from coronavirus, but can you explain, for everyone, whether monkeypox has the same sort of propensity for mutation?
Sorry, what was that? The last part?
Whether monkeypox has the same propensity for mutation and variants.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, monkeypox. So monkeypox is a DNA virus. COVID was a RNA virus. Now the difference between those is actually somewhat significant in that DNA viruses tend to be fairly stable, meaning there's not a lot of mutations. The kind of the replication machinery is a little bit more sophisticated. So most often in DNA viruses, we don't see a lot of mutation. Typically less variants. Now that doesn't mean it's less deadly. It doesn't mean that it has less ability to evade vaccines but typically viruses that do mutate rapidly can be challenging in that when you do develop a vaccine, that you're kind of always behind, because like we're seeing in COVID, the disease is mutating really quickly. And so how often do we need to do boosters? That tends to be less of the case for DNA viruses. So I think that, it's not a reason to be complacent with monkeypox, but it's certainly probably a feature of monkeypox that's important to know, because if we have to start using the vaccination for monkeypox that we currently have, I think we can be less concerned that we're going to be dealing, like with COVID, we're going to be dealing with a disease that's going to rapidly mutate, and we have to figure out, do we need to develop a booster, and how frequently do we administer the booster? So I think overall that's good news.
Yeah, I would worry based on what you've described today so far, and I'm still learning about monkeypox, that if it's a rodent reservoir, that maybe one complication could be the fact that we've seen rodent populations in the US spike as a result of restaurants being closed during the COVID pandemic. And so that concerns me.
Yeah,
in terms of how
absolutely.
It might, if through waste, there is a potential, or even just through, pet rodents of an infected individual getting kind of back in circulation with other rodents and having those infections. And of course, I think of, I wonder what about the parasites of those rodents, like ticks and things. Do they have the capability of transmitting? And I don't know if that's known yet or not.
Yeah, there's some thought that fleas can transmit disease. I don't think that's been verified, but there is belief that fleas might be able to transmit disease. So far, like I said, I think it's only been 6 or 7 species of rodents in these endemic countries, plus prairie dog in the 2003 outbreak in the Midwest. But I think one thing that we're going to see is, and we don't talk about as much, that the population density is such an important factor for infectious disease. I mean, that you increase the probability of transmission events as the population density increases. And since my parents were born in the 50s, the population has doubled in size from some 4 billion to now we're getting closer and closer to that 8 billion, 9 billion number, which we'll probably see in our lifetime. And that just increases the events of disease spread, or possibility for disease spread. And with that as well, we're seeing the human world push into the animal world as there's further urbanization, and also talking about urbanization, a lot of the populations live in these really dense areas like New York City and Los Angeles, which are just absolutely ripe for for disease to spread through. And so I think there's a lot of reason to be concerned. I think that, we can use historic outbreaks as some, lesson to be learned. But I think we also have to realize that the modern time with the population density that we have now is different than any time that humans have ever been alive on the planet. And, it's really a pretty fertile ground for infectious disease spread. Not to be a a downer.
No, this has been great. I mean, this has been really informative. Unless anybody else has any questions, I was going to thank Tom for presenting this information so concisely and clearly for everybody, and helping us also separate a little bit of fact from fiction in terms of, what people may be hearing in terms of the infodemic, that will accompany or is accompanying, monkeypox. Does anybody else have any final questions for Tom?
No, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks.
Thank you guys for having me. I just point people to the CDC has a lot of information up on their website talking about some changes that have happened from COVID. But I think CDC has already got a whole great site full of useful information. So just point anybody who's watching this and wants to learn more, go to the CDC website.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great. Thanks.
Right.
Thanks a lot, Tom. So
Take care.